My favorite sneakers are falling apart. Fortunately, I like to repurpose old junk into new junk. I mean, better junk. No, good junk. I'll let you be the judge of whether the things I make are junk or not. But for now, if I'm going to transform these old broken shoes into something nice, I'm going to need a good idea. And for that, I'm going to need to focus. By eliminating all distractions, I can engage my creativity to its fullest potential. I call this part of my process thinking. It can be strenuous and sometimes even painful, but it all becomes worth it when the right idea pops into your head. I'm going to turn these shoes into a hat. Ow, my eye. Now, the thing about making a hat out of old shoes is that it requires a lot of sewing, and that's not really something that I've done before. So, I'm going to have to learn a new skill for this project. As it turns out, sewing is fairly simple. You just need a thread and a needle. Then you need to thread the thread through the needle, tie a knot in the back of the thread, stick the needle through the cloth you want to join, and stick it through the other way. Pull it tight, then tie it off. It seems simple enough, but before I can start sewing things together, I first need to take things apart. But after giving my shoes a nice washing, I think I may have just created the coolest hat ever. Okay, so obviously I have a little bit more work to do. I need to undo all of this stitching. To call this process tedious would be an understatement. Now I've got these medieval underwear looking things, so I need to take off these eyelets. And that means it's time to bring in the big guns. Now this is something I know how to work with, except this isn't how you're supposed to use a drill. All it really did was mess up the coffee table. So I got some pliers to see if they could do it, and sure enough, do it they did. Once I finished completely destroying my shoes, I was left with this. Since these are Levi's shoes, it seemed appropriate to use some jeans as some added material. I'll also be using this hat purely for reference, although this would end up being a big mistake. My idea is to cut out a denim template and then sew pieces of the shoe onto that. I figured it might be helpful to make a mock-up to see how I'd use the pieces, but it wasn't. With everything disassembled and the basic idea formed, it's time for me to put into practice what I've learned about sewing. Right away, I almost made a terrible mistake. You see, if you want to hide your stitching, you need to sew what you're sewing inside out and then flip it around outside in. Flip it around inside, outside. Practicing what I learned, I made one of 6 pieces that will be sewn together to make the hat. As I repeated this monotonous process 6 times, my confidence in my newfound sewing skills grew. And it was just a matter of sewing those 6 pieces all together. Even that was surprisingly easy. At this point I thought, man, sewing really isn't that hard. You just loop the needle around a few times and bada bing bada boom, there's a hat. But then I realized we might have a slight problem. It turns out geometry is just as important as the needlework. I think it's time I consult an expert. She actually knows how to sew.
You need to get rid of this part. Press it like this and sew it down there, or unsaw all of this part and then have a pentagonist.
That's not a word.
That's not a word? Okay. Like a top part.
Let's do this. Armed with sound advice, I gathered up my wounded pride and began the process of, redoing everything. Cutting out the center part wasn't enough. I realized I needed to separate all my pieces and then cut them down to the same length. It was slightly painful to undo so much work, but it was better than looking like a garden gnome. Next, it was a matter of figuring out the shape of the, pentagonist. This little piece should prevent my hat from being pointy. I stitched all my triangles back together again, but then realized I was going to need another pentagonist. So I cut it out and sewed down the edges to make it look nice and joined everything together, and after all of that, it's not looking much better than it did before redoing everything. And I honestly kind of feel like giving up on this project at this point. Turns out sewing is a lot harder than I thought. And maybe a hat was just too ambitious for my first sewing project. But then I realized, but gosh dang it, I'm ambitious. So even if it's not perfect, I'm gonna persevere and make a hat. And not a hat you might imagine being worn by a mythical woodland creature, but a normal, albeit imperfect, hat. If I'm gonna do this, I'll need to recall some more of Deanna's advice.
Get like a watermelon or something and then place it there as a kind of like your head.
My head's not as big as a water.
Yes, it is.
I didn't have a watermelon, but I did have this, which would do the trick. I could use the curvature of this bowl to figure out what needed to be done to my hat in order to make it more, hat-shaped. Turns out I needed to bring in the seams near the bottom some. And while this made the hat look a lot more bowl-shaped, it was still far from being hat-shaped. So I took some measurements and got working on the opening in the back. This went a long ways in making my hat look a bit more like a hat, but it was still really small and I would need to add some extra material. And that's where my wife's pants come in. I'll use the waistband of these pants to be the band for the hat. This turned out to be a crucial step towards making my dreams of acceptably wearing footwear on my head a reality. I'm really glad that I stuck with it because after adding that band, it's starting to look like a real hat. Energized with a new hope this project could actually turn out half decent, I moved things forward by covering up some of that ugly stitching. The art of sewing has proved itself more difficult than I had expected, but at the same time, it's rewarding. After all, I would have just thrown those shoes away, but now they have a chance to be worn in a new way. So I'm happy to add this skill to my repertoire, even if it does require a lot of patience. Now I need to connect the back here, and I thought it would be cool to use the Levi's logo. That was gonna be a transition, but then my needle broke. So then I had to use this really fat needle, which was extremely difficult to push through all that material. So difficult, in fact, I had to use a pair of pliers, so by the time I finished with that, the light had completely changed, so the transition wasn't really gonna be that great. Anyway, just when I thought things were getting easy, it was time to make the brim. This is possibly one of the most essential parts of any good hat. I figured cardboard would do the trick for the structure. These pieces here will be sewn into the band to prevent the brim from flopping down. But obviously I don't want my hat to look like stinky old cardboard, so I'll be covering this with more denim. I stitched close to the edge of the cardboard, cut off the excess, then went to flip it inside out. Inside. For some reason it looked hideous and really small. Turned out I had inside-outed the pocket. The next step is to fold over some of the denim and attach it to the vertical bits of the cardboard. I opened up the seam in the band, then inserted the brim into the seam and sewed everything together. With the finish line in sight, I was sewing faster than Grandma. Actually, this is the real speed of the sewing. Took a long time. Now that the brim is attached, I can address some issues I've noticed along the way, like this wrinkle here. To sew that down, I needed to partially remove the pocket. And then, seeing that nice dark blue color, I thought, do I really want the pocket on there? I decided I liked that blue shade more than the gimmick of the pocket. After fixing that wrinkle, I had another glaring issue to solve: the pentagonist. So, yet again, I undid some of my work. Then I replaced the little pentagonist with a much larger pentagonist, made from the pocket I had just removed from the brim. And once that was on, it was time for my favorite part, the details. This project took me 2 months to complete. Looking back, I realize how foolish I was thinking I could do it in a week or 2. After many hours of hard work, few pricked fingers, and lots of sewing, it's finally time to see if the hat fits. I thought sewing would just come naturally, but the reality is, learning a new skill requires patience, perseverance, and teachability. And you know what? I like the hat that I made. Not because it's particularly cool or well made, because it's not. I like it because it represents the fact that if you have those 3 qualities, you can learn to do just about anything. All things considered, for my first time making a hat out of shoes and a pair of old jeans, I'd say it turned out alright. Maybe watch another one of my videos? See ya!